Well, so let's frame it this way. They say, like, oh, the U.S. can't afford to defend Taiwan. Ian, if the Chinese Communist Party does take Taiwan, is that something the U.S. can afford?
Of course not. Absolutely not. You know, the U.S. cannot, first and foremost, our country cannot afford to fail in preventing this war and in deterring this war from occurring in the first place. But if we do fail, as we might in the years ahead, you know, if our government fails and if the military fails to deter a conflict, which I don't think is going to happen, but if that were to happen, then we certainly cannot fail to prevent the Chinese amphibious operation or blockade or whatever it is to be successful. That Taiwan's continued freedom and democracy is absolutely vital to the national security of the United States. And anybody that says otherwise has not thought very much about this issue, I don't think. Most thoughtful analysts would look at it and they would think through the scenario. They would think through what the world would look like after something like that were to occur. And they would say, no, we don't want to live in a world like that. Because after World War II, you have not seen that. You've not seen great power conflict. You've not seen countries invade countries willy-nilly and have this kind of law of the jungle rule in the international community. There have been a few cases where it could have happened, like on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, with Kuwait in 1990, 91, right? The invasion of Kuwait. But the U.S. in each of these instances came to the rescue. And in those cases, those were dictatorships we rescued. Those weren't even vibrant democracies like Taiwan, pro-American democracies like Taiwan. And we still rescued them because after the lesson of World War II, which was the worst war ever fought in human history, the lesson there was we don't want to live in a world like that. We don't want to live in a world where you have these authoritarian countries who are revanchist, they're ambitious, they're expansionistic, they're militant, and they just invade smaller neighbors because they can, right? Because they're strong enough to do it. So they do it and they take that prize. We don't want to live in that world. That's why we have the United Nations. That's why the United Nations was founded in the first place, to try to prevent that from happening. That's why pretty much all of the major institutions of international global governance, like the International Monetary Fund and a whole raft of others, the World Trade Organization, they were all funded on that idea. Even the European Union was founded on that idea. We don't want to live in a world like that. We don't want to go back to the 1930s. And so that's why, and that's just one of many reasons why I think that the United States, is not going to let this happen. But if we do, then we're going to, I think, come to Taiwan's rescue.
So even if, like, let's say ideologically, you know, we don't care about democracy or the lives of the people in Taiwan or bubble tea, right? There's still a reason to go and defend Taiwan, because if we don't, then it's kind of like if you give a mouse a cookie, right? And then the PRC is going to keep expanding beyond Taiwan. Like, is that kind of what you're getting at?
I mean, if you give the PRC a cookie, it's going to want milk. And if you give it milk, things, as you guys have read the story, right? It spins out of control in a hurry, right? That's the world of 1930s, right? That's what happens. And we don't want that to happen.
So basically what you're saying is a war for Taiwan would not be the start of World War III. China taking Taiwan would be the start of World War III.
I think I've never thought of it quite like that, but Chris, that's a really interesting way to frame it. And I think that's right.
But, you know, if they take Taiwan, surely they'll stop there. You just sign a peace deal with them, and they promise to not expand further. And I think history shows us that works.
Definitely. Well, so Ian, you've come up with two interesting points that the U.S. right now is trying to prevent any kind of war for Taiwan. If that fails, then you're going to be in a situation where the U.S. will have to do something to defend Taiwan. So I'm curious, what can the U.S. do now to support Taiwan to prevent any kind of conflict? And in the event of a conflict, if the U.S. does fail to stop it, what could the U.S. do then?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think it's one that deserves a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and actually a lot of study. Because deterrence theory, as we know it today, as an academic field, is very thin. It's very bare bones. And there's not a lot of brain power that's been invested in it since the end of the Cold War. And even in the latter years of the Cold War, when we started to have precision weaponry and stealth technology and things of that nature, there was not a good understanding of, or even a good theory of how all that would work when you have, sophisticated conventional weapons that can actually have nuclear level effects on the enemy, and then combine that with escalation and then potential nuclear strikes. And then now today we're in an era where we have Chinese Communist Party controlled infrastructure, basic infrastructure in our country, in all countries. I mean, if you look at Mexico, right? 4 of Mexico's largest container ports are all run by the Chinese Communist Party through the state-owned enterprises. Some of our American container ports have ZPMC systems and cranes in them, which are, again, ZPMC is a front for the PLA and the Chinese security services by law in the PRC. And that's true for pretty much every country in the world where you see things like that go on. So how does that impact deterrence? We don't know. How does cyber warfare impact deterrence? I don't know. I don't know anybody who's working on a PhD dissertation or a book to try to find out. There's just so much that we don't understand about modern warfare because happily we haven't had to experience it, right? There's all these weapons capabilities now that China has and that Taiwan has too, and that we have even more of it in many cases. And no one's ever seen what it looks like when they are exchanged. No one has any data on that. There's a lot of war games that go on, but you have to realize war games are not supposed to be predictive, and they're not predictive. No computer can tell you what a future fight would look like. War games are based on guesses, huge numbers of guesses programmed in them by humans who are just guessing. And the results are pure wind. And they're meant to be, right? The purpose of a war game is, for example, that the Rand Corporation or others would run, and you read about these sometimes in the news. The purpose is to make an American military officer experience defeat. You want them to experience defeat.
Kobayashi Maru scenario.
Yeah, exactly. You want them. Actually, I'm pretending I understand that metaphor. I don't understand what you just meant. But
watch more Star Trek.
Let's pretend I'm cool enough to understand what you just said.
Let's pretend you're uncool enough to understand.
No. Very, very cool.
You guys
very
get it,
cool.
Shelley? Matt, did you get that? What syndrome?
No. Kobayashi Maru. That's in Star Trek. It was like an unwinnable scenario, right?
I love that Shelley can explain it.
It was a program computer war game, like war simulation, and then there was no way to win it.
Okay, yes, yeah. That's a good example. That's a good metaphor, right?
Except for Captain Kirk, he won it.
Is that right?
Well, spoiler, Chris.
Well, because he doesn't believe in no-win scenarios. He reprogrammed the program to make it winnable. Aha.
So he would actually not be a good officer in today's military.
That's what Spock said.
A good officer has to not question the game, and you have to lose. You have to experience that because, and this is not just true for the military, this is true for all people. We always learn more from the games that we lose than we learn from the games we win, right? And that's the point of these war games is you want military officers to experience defeat, and then you want them to talk about it. And you want them to figure out what they could have done better. And that way, if there's ever a real world fight that they get into, they'll be much better equipped for it. And so all the reports that you see about how, in Pentagon war games, U.S. loses 9 out of 10 times or 10 out of 10 times, it's supposed to be that way. If it's not that way, the war games are not being programmed correctly, right? And so what's the name of that syndrome?
Kobayashi Maru scenario, I think.
Kobayashi Maru. You actually want that. You want a Kobayashi Maru syndrome programmed into these things.
Star Trek is so ahead of its time. Well, I'm glad I've influenced, hopefully, the dialogue in Taiwan security issues now to include a bit more references to Star Trek.
Actually, Star Trek, I have much to learn about Star Trek, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I think the idea of a Borg, that you will be assimilated, resistance is futile, I think that is a really good way to explain Chinese psychological warfare. That's the message, right? That is their message constantly. And actually, it goes back to this, Marxist-Leninist thought. It goes back to international communism, back to 1919 when you first had, what was it called? Intercom established. Communist or Comintern. Communist International, right? When it was established in Moscow, that was the idea, is that they were going to spread communism and socialism around the world. And that resistance was futile, that they were going to assimilate everybody and everything. And there was nothing anybody could do about it. And that was their propaganda line. And that continues to this day. That the Chinese Communist Party continues to have this narrative that socialism ultimately will win and capitalism will die. And that resistance to that in Taiwan or the United States or anywhere else is futile. And Shelley, that gets to your earlier point about their propaganda and how they've influenced some Americans to actually believe in that and actually to write on their behalf and to, project this false narrative.
So even though modern China might try and present it as like, nice private businesses, it's capitalism, even though there's this front of sort of, the Ferengi rules of acquisition, really it's still the Borg.
Just say
I think it's the Borg. I think it's the Borg. I think that's a really good way to describe it.
I know what this section of the podcast is going to be called.